Hello, and welcome to Conversations with Dr. Greer. This is Dr. Stephen Greer, and I'm the director of the Disclosure Project and CSETI. And also, we're, of course, as you all know, launching this film, Sirius, which should come out in the spring of this year. So we're wrapping that up. And I'd like to thank the folks at the World Puja Network for hosting us here every 2 weeks to bring you up to date around the world with all the projects that we're working on. We have a new website where all these projects are being put under one roof, as it were, at least internet roof, and it's SiriusDisclosure.com. That's SIRIUS Disclosure.com. So you can go there and see what we're doing with the film, see what we're doing with the new energy effort, disclosure, and the CSETI contact operations and programs. So I'm very excited today to have with us someone who is, I think, probably the most important and special guest I've ever had on this program. And he's a man of enormous integrity who has been involved and assisted with some of the very important work Disclosure Project has been doing, and has been a great friend and ally for over 20 years. In fact, I believe we met in 1991. And his name is Commander Will Miller. He's a retired U.S. Navy officer. He is someone who has worked very closely with me to help bring the information about the UFO and extraterrestrial issue to some of the highest-ranking members of our military in setting up briefings and meetings here in the United States. And he's also been, I think, the most important advisor to the project in helping us understand how the system works and what the reality is versus the perception out there in the public about secret programs, top secret programs, and as we'll get into, unacknowledged special access projects. So I'd like to thank Commander Miller for being with us today. Thank you, Will, for being here.
Well, you're very welcome, Steve. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, why don't you? It'd be great if the folks listening would get a sense of the lay of the land. I think one of the things I want people to understand is how the government works, or as we get further into this hour, how the government doesn't work on certain issues, but how it's designed within the military and intelligence community in terms of classified programs. I wonder if you could just speak to that, because I know you have a great knowledge of it.
Sure, and there are a lot of misconceptions about secrecy and classification, particularly when it comes to this subject. First, there are many folks that would say, well, nothing should be classified. The government should be able to open all of their files and give us anything we want. And obviously, there is a need for classification, legitimate classification, for some programs to protect national intelligence information and information, the disclosure of which would cause grave harm to the nation. We would not have wanted the Germans to get all of the information about how to build an atomic bomb. That could have been a grave problem in changing the outcome of World War II. But that said, you frequently hear folks talk about, well, this program must be above top secret. And actually, there are only 3 levels of classification in the military: confidential, secret, and top secret.
Right. And
those being made by an individual, by the classifier, based on certain criteria as to what kind of harm their release would cause to the government. And there are, however, handling caveats, things like eyes only, so you can have secret eyes only information. Secret ORCON, which is originator controlled. In other words, only the person who created the classified information controls who gets to see it.
Right.
Or ESI, especially sensitive information, or even no foreign dissemination. And then, of course, you hear the term cosmic top secret thrown around, and the cosmic classification is a NATO unique classification. But all that aside, there's a major issue as to how secrecy is maintained in the military, particularly with respect to what we call special access programs, or SAPs. Now, you can have special access programs that have any number of classifications. Most of them are top secret, with some of the handling caveats that I mentioned earlier. The way they work is, if there is a program that the information is so sensitive that only a few people need to know about that, then there is a special access program created. In other words, you have to have special access to have knowledge of that program. So even if you have a top secret clearance, you may not have access to that particular SAP because you don't have the need to know. All right? And there are pros and cons to having such programs. One of the pros is that you can keep the information very close to the vest, so to speak. You can control who knows about it. But at the same time, many times you don't know that there are others working on other special access programs that may have information that would be helpful to your program. And because the two don't intermingle,
that's right,
you many times are denied access to information that in your SAP would be helpful to you, or to technologies that would be helpful to you. So that's kind of how special access programs work. And in general, once you get into that line of classification, you are generally available for other special access programs. In other words, once you are read in, you sign the documents, and many times sign your life away forever in terms of never being able to release that information as long as you live. So then we move to another category of USAPs, or unacknowledged special access programs. Now, things get kind of interesting here.
Right.
The fact that they are unacknowledged, and Congress, by the way, has oversight of all classified programs, supposedly even over unacknowledged special access programs. There is supposed to be one person who is cleared to the highest level to follow and track that USAP. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen.
Right.
So you have a program, the existence of which is totally unacknowledged. In other words, nobody knows about it except the people that created it and those that are read into that unacknowledged program. That can lead to misuse, and it can lead to the improper classification of programs and activities that should otherwise be available. So it is within the area of unacknowledged special programs where we would most likely find information on the unidentified flying objects, extraterrestrial intelligence, and related technologies.
And this is one of the things that we have from information from people that are Disclosure Project witnesses that began in the 1950s. In fact, I was given a date by a senior scientist at the Naval Research Labs. It was October 1954, where some of this information went into compartments that were in the unacknowledged arena that have become so developed but have become also so powerful and off the radar of the oversight of Congress or the President, and as we'll get into this discussion, some of the senior members of the military and intelligence community, that they pretty much have gotten up and sort of like a Frankenstein and walked off the table. And this was what I encountered when, in during the Clinton years, I briefed President Clinton's first director of Central Intelligence, the CIA director, who informed me that he and the President had attempted to find out about this subject of UFOs and had been told nothing, and in fact had been told nothing existed or denied access. And subsequently, I know that someone who was encouraging me to begin the Disclosure Project back in the 90s actually admitted that subsequent to that and to my briefing, the CIA director, this is the man who works for the CIA, went over and began to discuss that problem of this sort of over-compartmentalization And it harkens to mind what President Eisenhower said when he said, beware the military-industrial complex. And, of course, he was a very patriotic, conservative Republican member of our presidential lineage, who was, of course, also, for those you don't know, a 5-star general, which, of course, we don't have anymore. But and we don't have a 5th star for generals at this point. But Eisenhower, when he said beware the military-industrial complex, it is my understanding it was because it was between 1954 and the end of his administration in January of 1961, just before Jack Kennedy took office, that a lot of these programs really got legs, and it was because they figured out a great deal of the science and technology behind the energy and propulsion systems behind what the public would now call UFOs, although that's not what they were called back then. They were actually called flying saucers, extraterrestrial vehicles, et cetera, and so on. So that's just some background historically for people to understand, how serious the issue has become.
Yes, and as you mentioned, many of these special access programs, and particularly unacknowledged special access programs, who draw their money ultimately from the taxpayers. It comes through the defense budget.
Right.
USAPs many times act as little mini vacuum cleaners, sucking up end-of-year money from other programs, and so it's very difficult, if not impossible, to trace their sources of funding. But when you get into the subject of UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence, there are two perceptions in the public. One is that, the highest leaders in the military obviously must know about this,
right,
and must have access to all information. And what we have found is that is absolutely not the case. In fact, to ensure that those leaders in high levels of military and civilian positions, such as the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, he would be protected from knowledge on this particular subject, so that if there was a Freedom of Information Act request, a FOIA request, or a congressional inquiry, he could, with perfectly clear conscience and veracity, go before any of those bodies and say, I have no knowledge of that subject. And he'd be completely honest. He did not. He'd be protected. However, somewhere in his organization, there would be people who would have great information and be the custodians of that. Many times some of the senior civilian employees who have continuity as the military leaders come and go.
Yes, I call it the permanent bureaucracy that exists, as opposed to, say, the CIA director that comes every 2 to 4 to 6 years, or the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which, for those of you who don't know, it's like the CIA within the Pentagon. It's very large, but it's its own intelligence and the analytic and gathering entity for the Pentagon, as opposed to the CIA. And what I have found, and of course in direct meetings with a number of these figures, is that they are not lying when they say, we honestly don't know anything about this subject. And in fact, when we have made inquiries, we have been told nothing. And in one case, when I had a document that had some of the code numbers and names for some of these unacknowledged special access project compartments from the National Reconnaissance Office, there was a certain admiral, I remember, had found one of those and basically was told, yeah, well, we know who you are, but you don't have a need to know, and we're not going to tell you anything. And this gets into the question of what I call legal secrecy, which would be the kinds of things that were being tapped into by the WikiLeaks people, and things that are sort of ordinary, and illegal secrecy or unconstitutional secrecy, of which there have been many, many books written, and which becomes of great concern in a democracy in terms of who's minding the hen house and who's minding the store if there's not this oversight. And if I can just give one example, I recently met with a man in Washington who's an auditor for one of the big three auditing accounting companies that audits contracts for the government, and he was assigned to audit Northrop Grumman, which